Welcome to the Mindful News podcast, and today joining Jonathan and I is the director of the Mindfulness Initiative and clerk to the UK Mindfulness All-Party Parliamentary Group, Jamie Bristow.
What we're starting to work on really is what we call trainable inner capacities of heart and mind. So we're starting to see that mindfulness has been used as an umbrella term for a whole range of things that we can choose to cultivate through intentional practice, right? And that kind of umbrella term is starting to break down a little bit as we're sort of looking at other things that we can practice. There's a kind of business model issue with our attention. Like a lot of the business models are about fragmenting, distracting, capturing, keeping, selling our attention. And that's the
almost hypnotizing in a way, yeah.
Or our data, I guess. Yeah. And there's a business model to keep you coming back and keep you engaged, right? So Headspace, tremendously skillful use of technology, particularly for men. And we found back in, I remember in Headspace days, is at that time, might have changed now, men are more comfortable with it. But at that time, women much more like to turn up to a group, in the workplace or something, and to talk about their feelings amongst colleagues. Men much happier to stick their headphones on and look like they're listening to music when actually they're meditating, And so it just made meditation accessible to just millions of people who would never turn up to something. So in 2013, the crucial first step was that there was a mindfulness teaching program established. So this is where the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, which is sort of part of the university, started teaching politicians, and they have done that. Actually, another company's taken over now in the last couple of years. But since then, since 2013, over 400 MPs and members of the House of Lords have had some mindfulness training.
Incredible, yeah.
Richard Laird was one of the first, and in fact, he, along with Chris Rowan, a member of Parliament, were instrumental in inviting the Oxford Mindfulness Centre to start teaching other politicians.
Jamie Bristow is director of the Mindfulness Initiative, a policy institute about mindfulness and compassion training that grew out of a programme of mindfulness teaching for politicians in British Parliament. We talk about the game-changing efforts that are taking place to educate our politicians, to meditate and understand the benefits so that change can be made in the correct way from the very top. Now, Jamie spent many years helping to teach and share mindfulness, having worked with Andy at Headspace as the Business Development Director, and also was the co-director of the Mindfulness Initiative, founded originally in 2013 by Chris Cullen and Madeline Bunting to support British politicians in forming the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Mindfulness. We dig into Jamie's early years, his desire to help others, what it means to be intentional, foundational mindfulness, and we discuss his passion for climate change. Also visit mindfulnews.uk for all of our podcasts, powerful video clips, and our growing library of free inspiring guided meditations, including the mental push-up. My co-host Jonathan has some cool meditations that I encourage you to check out, and links to these are in the description. I'm your host, Guy, on our continuing mission to help as many people organically. Jamie, thank you so much for taking the time to join. It's an incredible honour for Jonathan and I.
It's my great pleasure. Lovely to be here. Thank you.
And I'll jump into my first question. You show a strong desire to help others, the people, the planet, but also helping on a big scale. This idea of be the change in the world that you want to see. So I'm very interested to know, where does that come from? What part of your upbringing and your early experience created this? Where does that come from? Just to get a little insight into that.
That's a beautifully original question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. Well, funnily enough, when I was in school, I did one of those careers, surveys or, tests that kind of tells you what you should be. And I did one which had tree with thickness of branches, depending on how likely a career path it is. And there's a career down to kind of finance-based stuff or tech-based stuff. And there was an arm on the tree that was something like caring-based stuff. And that was a withered, completely, almost non-existent branch on my tree at that time. It was maybe a doctor or maybe one of the caring professions or work for a charity or something like that. Didn't really cross my mind. And I grew up in a household where one of the main bits of advice was do something you love and earn enough money to have nice holidays. That was the formula. And to some extent, the house was also quite scientific materialist, like nothing to see here. The world's quite straightforward. Consciousness is an epiphenomena. The Big Bang is the beginning and the end of it, sort of thing. And now things are so different in both ways. As you say, working for others in service is the main driving force of my life. And certainly I have a lot more open perspective on what might be going on here in the world than that kind of materialist, background might suggest. But what happened? Well, when I left university, I think I still mainly wanted to work in advertising, which I did for a few years, and be the chief executive of an ad agency. And that was fine. That was, sum total of my aspirations, I think.
What did you study at school and university?
Sorry?
Yeah, just quickly.
What did I study?
Yeah. What was your
I studied psychology, I guess. So I was already interested in the mind. But yeah, it was curiosity rather than a desire to necessarily help people that much, I'm being completely honest. But there was definitely some latent stuff there. And, a very caring family all the same. And I genuinely credit my meditation practice with changing the direction of my life in that way. So is it just the meditation practice? I think probably not. I think there are ways in which my personality type or things from my background and family, etc., were maybe latent and then unactivated until that point. But the practicing of compassion, the practicing of mindful awareness, and the studying of what you might call, the Dharma, or like the teachings relating to how to live a skillful life in this world and the nature of this world, completely transformed my life direction and what I want to do.
But was it meditation in a Buddhist sense or in a secular mindfulness sense? How was your introduction to that?
To be honest, I took it where I could get it. And initially there was a Buddhist and meditation society in university, which had a kind of Buddhist flavor, but they were aware that most people wouldn't necessarily be, fully into that. And then I guess I practiced in a kind of Buddhist environment. Yeah, but like in very accessible ways that weren't sort of heavy on the Buddhism or any commitment at that time. And really it was sort of mindfulness of breathing and sort of kindness and compassion practices that did the thing.
So then you worked at Headspace for just under 2 years. Shout out to Andy, one of our podcast alumni.
Yeah.
It was wonderful talking with him. So as the business development director, and then a year later, the Headspace for Teams director. And for those that don't know, Headspace specializes in mindfulness meditation online, but particularly through their incredible app. And is one of the leading meditation apps available and reaches millions of people globally. And for you, what were some of the most impactful learning lessons from that experience in those roles and working with Andy?
Oh, yeah. So I guess we might come back to the sort of climate change stuff. But in between my advertising times and working for Headspace, I spent some time working for a climate change campaign, and then decided that I really needed to help make mindfulness and meditation more accessible, because I saw that for me, it was the thing that radically changed my perspective on the climate crisis issue. And I saw Headspace doing something that I thought was so skillful and I would really love to be a part of. And that's what the co-founder, Andy's co-founder, Rich Pearson, talks about, like rebranding meditation. Because I was an advertising executive, he was an ex-advertising executive of a kind of like similar rival advertising agency. And so, as an ad man teaming up with Andy, he saw that at that time, particularly, you couldn't say the word meditation. It was totally far out woo stuff, and no one knew what mindfulness was. So how do you talk about it?
Yes.
And I just thought they've done such a service, both to their users, but also just to make it down to earth and cool and a household name thing, and that's partly what we've been doing from a different way. We've been working with mindfulness in politics and public policy, which people often use as a reference point to say like how credible and sort of like, not weird this is. Hey, even the politicians doing it,
Yeah.
But that's what I really learned, I guess, was a lot about language. What Rich and Andy had over time realized that you couldn't say, what was safe to say, what was changing, what John Kabat-Zinn calls the languaging of mindfulness, like they were just so skillful in figuring out what images to use. In fact, the lack of images, they decided not to use any photographs and just had this kind of like culturally transferable illustration style. And yeah, so I just have such respect for Rich's vision, particularly, and just Andy's integrity and content. That's kind of always been there. That partnership, I think, initial partnership is what has been the main pillar of their success.
Right. And then you, I don't know if it's part 3 of this concept of agency, right? Because I think maybe we can look a bit into that, agency, that term later on. But that technology can aid collaboration, however, can also create conflict and fragmentation. Did you notice any of the latter at Headspace? And, with the fact that the technology is kind of the medium used to deliver the teachings.
Great question. And you're referring to the Mindfulness Developing Agency in Urgent Times document that we created, having researched lots of different aspects of where the world is kind of having problems going wrong and that interact with each other. And the environmental crises are kind of just one part of that. There's democratic crises, there's a crisis of our information ecology, our information commons, the media landscape, and particularly the influence of digital on our lives.
Yes.
And it's popular at the moment to slam it with the release of the documentary A Social Dilemma, which is fun. I think it's required watching for every citizen, to be honest with you. And we may be starting to not see all the amazing ways in which it's helped us to connect with each other, and in some ways has made our lives sort of simpler and freed up time, etc., etc. However, it's causing us all kinds of problems. And fundamentally, there's a kind of business model issue with our attention. Like a lot of the business models are about fragmenting, distracting, capturing, keeping, selling our attention. And that's the
almost hypnotizing in a way. Yeah.
Or our data, I guess. Yeah. And there's a business model to like keep you coming back and keep you engaged, right? So Headspace, tremendously skillful use of technology, particularly for men. And we found back in, I remember in Headspace days, is like, at that time, might have changed now, men are more comfortable with it. But at that time, women much more like to turn up to a group, in the workplace or something, and to talk about their feelings amongst colleagues. Men much happier to stick their headphones on and look like they're listening to music when actually they're meditating, And so it just made meditation accessible to just millions of people who would never turn up to something. However, there's a business model issue in like keeping people in the ecosystem. I know the guy is aware of this, but it's like as soon as you have a software as a service model, which is what they call it, SaaS model, which basically most of our successful apps are, they want you to sign up for every month for a year or whatever, and they want to keep you in the system. Ideally, forgetting that you've even subscribed in the first place, or that kind of thing. Then you have an incentive to keep people doing what you're doing. And although they said our objective is to get people to graduate from Headspace, to no longer need it and to go on to other things, there's always that tension there. That's antithetical to your business model at the same time as you sort of wanted to do that. And then you also have to kind of gamify stuff a little bit. Like, is gamifying mindfulness right? Giving people badges and run streaks and that kind of thing. Is that the right way to keep people there? And so that, I think that they are navigating it fairly well, but there are tensions. And of course, there are tensions.
Well, then in 2015, after about a year and 8 months at Headspace, you then joined the Mindfulness Initiative as director. I see director and co-director in another source. Perhaps you can clarify. I don't know if that was an evolution, but before you answer that. So originally founded in 2013 by Chris Cullen and Madeline Bunting, and this idea of supporting British politicians in forming this all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness. And we spoke about, John Kabat-Zinn and Ruby Wax being, some of the patrons, former alumni on the podcast, and also the wonderful Lord Richard Layard, who is founder of the Action for Happiness charity, program director at the London School of Economics, but also vice chair at the party.
Of our all-party group.
Of the all-party group, yeah. So how would you summarize the last 5 years? Like I said, don't necessarily have to get into the weeds, but in terms of progress, creating awareness, creating change. Can you just share with some of our listeners some of the key achievements and progress?
Yeah. So in 2013, the crucial first step was that there was a mindfulness teaching program established. So this is where the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, which is sort of part of the university, started teaching politicians, and they have done that. Actually, another company's taken over now in the last couple of years. But since then, since 2013, over 400 MPs and members of the House of Lords have had some mindfulness training.
Incredible, yeah.
Richard Laird was one of the first. And in fact, he, along with Chris Rowan, a member of Parliament, were instrumental in inviting the Oxford Mindfulness Centre to start teaching other politicians. And it was really driven out of their personal interest, having experienced some profound benefit in the science behind what they learned and the potential applications within their day job, like public policy. Whereas this stuff showing up in health, education, criminal justice, and the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And, could it be better applied? So that inquiry was what I turned up to help with. I was one of the volunteers and experts, working at Headspace at the time, to support those politicians who had been practicing, to form this all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness, which is like a student society for backbench MPs. There are sort of hundreds of them. Yeah. Some are more active than others. And it's like a forum for mutual inquiry and making recommendations to government on a cross-party basis, right? So we helped them to form that group. We ran our first policy inquiry, which is probably still the biggest we did, because it featured 8 or 9 hearings and published the world's first public policy report about mindfulness training called Mindful Nation UK. And that was 2015 or so. And it was at that point that I was invited to take over as director of the Mindfulness Initiative, having been running the criminal justice strand of the inquiry. And since then have been continuing the work, because there's no use like just launching a public policy report and expecting anyone to do anything about it. Like that's kind of the starting gun, not the finish line.
Yes.
You need to then go to ministers, evolve what it is that you're asking for, do the conference circuit, now the podcast circuit, tell people about it for about 3 years afterwards, before it starts to actually really influence thinking. And to do that, I needed some support and infrastructure. And so basically fundraise for my own job to do the work that was needed and to really make use of the great potential that we had on our hands. Because going through this initial process, this inquiry, the halo effect was it was kind of bringing the field together, helping people to connect, inspiring other politicians in other parliaments around the world. Nice. So we got invited to, me and Chris Rowan, he called us the Laurel and Hardy of mindfulness, because I'm quite tall and thin and he's quite something else that I won't mention. But he and I toured, particularly around Europe, but also doing meetings in Sri Lanka and Australia and Canada, etc., and have helped to establish mindfulness in 10 national parliaments and inspire policy inquiries as well. So the Mindfulness Initiative France and the Mindfulness Initiative Austria, I think, to follow directly in our footsteps with the name at least. So we had some success. So your initial question is that we did have some success since then, and most of the criminal justice recommendations were sort of followed to the letter by a team in the Ministry of Justice who used our report as impetus to form a steering group and then work on it for 4 years. So you couldn't have hoped for a better outcome there. And then in health, there was a kind of messier and longer term business. Basically, we've got to where we need to be. Education is more nuanced, and the workplace much more diverse a sector and huger sector, but made good progress there through our other activities. And beyond that, which I'm sure we'll start talking about later in the conversation, we moved from looking at sort of direct policy applications to specific things that ministers already knew they needed help with, like, for instance, the depression rates in the UK. And we have strong and specific evidence showing that mindfulness training, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy helps with recurrent depression. We moved from that to trying to join the dots between all of these different bits of data, all these different applications, and all of the siloed potential policy applications, in order to create a bigger picture and frame mindfulness and compassion training more recently as foundational capacities for a flourishing society, rather than just a fix for that, this or the other. And that's brought us even more success.
So, John, before we'll hand it to you for a question, I think my last couple of points on this is I've noticed myself when my niche, corporate world, teaching mindfulness, and I found a lot of struggle, when I mention the word mindfulness off the bat, because they don't know what it is, or the connotations of something meditation related or Buddhist related. And so then I started over the years to change the approach. And now, I'm very much more about how to upskill employees. The World Economic Forum speaks of, what are the skills that are going to be important for management in the next 3 or 4 years with more automation, more AI and stuff like critical thinking, emotional intelligence, creativity, and so on. And it's very interesting to hear your comment about, a good story trumps a big stack of research papers. Maybe unfortunately, but yeah, we got this data. We got lots of research, government people, politicians, check it out. But I'm falling on deaf ears potentially, So does the labeling of the word mindfulness immediately pigeonhole you? And just if you can share some insight with us into some of the challenges that you and your team face when talking at the government level with politicians and decision makers about why should politicians care about mindfulness and how it can impact these different areas of public policy that you spoke about. And, what have you had to overcome?
Yeah, so we started from a very low base, in terms of what people understood of mindfulness. Like this was 2014. I mean, that famous Time magazine cover where you had the kind of blonde woman with her eyes closed on the front of Time magazine saying the mindfulness revolution. And I think that was sort of around that time. But certainly it wasn't much before that when the press started taking notice of this as a mainstream phenomenon. And politicians might have come across it in the papers initially in 2014. And certainly meditation, the word meditation was a no-no in politics and policy. And we had a serious education job to do in the early years. But where we got to is that it's a fairly credible and safe thing to talk about. And they have a superficial understanding of what it is. It's calm, it's chill out, it's taking some time, some me time or something, which of course we know it's a hell of a lot more than that. And rather than being a kind of a well-being nice to have, it should be a learning and development hygiene factor. As I say, framing it as a kind of foundational capacity for a whole load of other things, rather than it being, So there's still, I'd say, poor and shallow understanding of it, but it is at least credible. And one of the things that helped actually was we had the launch of our public policy report. We managed to get 3 government ministers to the launch to speak.
Yeah.
Now, getting any government ministers to an all-party parliamentary group meeting is pretty good going, but we had 3, including a Secretary of State for Education and the mental health minister. And so it's things like that kind of word got around, I guess. That was an interesting phenomenon. So it built up over time. What's interesting now is that the word mindfulness, and I don't know what your experience is, but in the workplace, in most workplaces now, it's also completely accepted. I mean, we have it's large
made progress in leaps and bounds, that's for sure, in the last 5-10 years, for sure, yeah.
It might be just smaller organizations, but larger organizations that I don't know, particularly kind of banks or lawyers or advertising agencies, most of them will have some kind of mindfulness training program. Some of them now, investing 6 figures annually in a program. I mean, some are not that many, but and you have people whose job it is to coordinate that mindfulness program. Like an HSBC, for instance. I was on ITV News in the UK recently talking about how I really respect what HSBC have done.
Wow.
Anyway, what's interesting is we're starting to sense in some places the word meditation has become more acceptable and attractive than the word mindfulness. Mindfulness having been the safe word, meditative practices, Mindfulness kind of got slammed a little bit in the press, either as being shallow or this kind of
mindfulness
thing,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it's really reinforced it as this, sort of shallow calming thing, whereas some people are like, okay, give me the meditation, give me the real stuff. Whatever that is, not really sort of saying that these are, in many ways, not understanding the overlapping concepts and that kind of thing. And so, and actually mindfulness is the less attractive word. In politics and policy, it still has to be mindfulness.
Oh, really?
But in some types of workplace,
okay,
in some mainstream contexts, in some popular culture contexts, actually meditation is an easier word to talk about. And I have expected this evolution in language for some time. As I've been saying to John Kabat-Zinn and others, mindfulness is going to be so 2015, not because it will not continue to be a foundational capacity for a flourishing individual, group, society, but because it has been overused as an umbrella term. It's had too much put in it. It's been used in so many different ways. It's a practice, it's a training, it's a way of being, it's a capacity, it's a state, it's a trait, it's a, I want to sort of map all the different, all the different types of way in which the word is used. And it's obviously muddy in that way. But also, we like to use it as a particular capacity to pay attention to what the ability to be aware of what's going on in and around us with the attitude of openness, allowing curiosity and care. It's a natural human capacity. But most people think about it as a broad set of disciplines and techniques and practices in a training program or a pastime. And that contains so many different things. It does have a bit of ethical inquiry, and it does have a bit of embodiment, and it does have a bit of kindness and compassion and all that kind of thing. And some people will say, the problem with mindfulness is it's just too narrow. It's just about like this sort of narrow sense of awareness or whatever, or attention regulation, understanding of it. Well, I suppose in some definitions of mindfulness, you could say that. I mean, Matthew Ricard is like this. You have to talk about compassion, same time as mindfulness, because
altruism,
is cold. But that's not the way it's taught. That's not most people's experience of it. And particularly now, it goes hand in hand with kindness and compassion practices in mindfulness course. So my sense is that we're coming to a point where we don't quite know what to call all this stuff. And I'm in the point of inquiry with some of my, confidence advisors and answers on a postcard, please. Where do we go to now if we want a more nuanced conversation? We want to talk about equanimity and the role of joy and the role of compassion, the role of awe, the role of, all of these things which are cultivatable, gratitude, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't want to use the word dharma because it's a foreign word, which basically just means all of those things thrown in together. And, do we say inner capacities? That's my best guess at the moment. Trainable inner capacities of heart and mind, or inner development. Do we talk about that? Because I'm also involved in the inner development goals, this new project, which is basically saying in order to meet the sustainable development goals, these external goals, we also need some inner goals, inner development goals for us to be equal to the challenge. And so that's a very long-winded answer to a quite simple question. But language is a big part of what I've been doing for the last 8 years.
The idea of storytelling, which you were saying earlier on, right? The importance of storytelling, because that's, when you get that right, that's how you get the communication right. That's how you get the message.
Totally,
right.
Yeah. I came across a phrase recently, which made sense of me. Like, am I a thought leader? Yeah, I guess. But I feel more like I'm a narrative entrepreneur, which I really like. Like basically coming up with new narratives and then selling them.
Yeah. Interesting, because that's how, the definition of like gurus and prophets, not to call you a guru or a prophet, but it's the idea of taking complex ideas and putting it in such a way that is digestible and that is transferable to the masses.
Oh, believe me, you've got to do that for politicians.
Yeah. So Jonathan, can you share a little bit to our listeners as well? So, why were you so keen to get Jamie on the podcast? And, when after having seen his work and his conversations, what is it that you want to ask and take this opportunity to dive into?
Well, like I said, it's obvious, with all the work he's done, that he's doing and that he will do, that he genuinely cares. Again, mindfulness, as we've been talking about it, through practice, we are able to get past some of our personal challenges and some of our illnesses and coping with all of that. But it's not limited to that. And two of the things that I aim to do on a daily basis personally on social media is to educate and encourage. Those are very important. And getting into the science of it all. And it can be a little discouraging at times because, people want to grab onto sometimes the, inspirational quotes and things like this. And that's beautiful. But how can we get a little bit deeper in sharing some of this? And, there's always the non-judgmental element of mindfulness as well. We start developing our own practice and becoming, realizing how interconnected we are with everything, with this planet. I mean, it's our responsibility to wake up to a lot of this. So, and in this area, maybe too, as well, where I am, it's start to care a little more, and you want to go out and talk about it a little bit in your own community. And, I've been told by even people that I'm even a little close to, like, you're getting a little too liberal now. And what do you mean by that? I mean, I just care about people. I care about the planet. And that's how Guy and I connected. And that's the reason that we bring on wonderful guests like yourself, Jamie, because this is important. I mean, sustainability, it's important. The common thing that we all should realize is love and care. And, well, I'm rattling on, but what my question is to you is, how would you encourage people that want to express and share some of these issues, both on social media and in our own communities, that's in a way that's non-judgmental? And like you said, maybe mindfulness, for example, is not the right word to approach. Maybe you hear these expressions, emotional intelligence, getting into the science of it all. Do we get into the compassion area? I mean, there's so many areas that we can get into with this, but how would you suggest going about that?
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit already, and that's my sense is that there's a missing piece in how we've been talking about mindfulness. And it's not surprising because, the piece was missing when mindfulness came into society in the mainstream. And it was kind of on its own as a vanguard thing that you can do to train your heart and train your mind. But we kind of need to make the case for doing anything like that first. The question is, what are you practicing?
Mm-hmm.
And to make the case for like us needing to level up, to mature, to develop ourselves in order to be equal to the challenges of our times. And I think there's appetite for that, and you see it in places like the vast popularity of Jordan Peterson, who's basically telling, part of that's like, tidy your room, clean up, have a bit of discipline. He's talking about like ethical principles. You might not agree with them. And he's telling you to do some practices that will make you, in the long run, more able to contribute. But it's interesting. He's incredibly diverse and divisive, controversial figure.
Thoroughly entertaining. But yeah.
Yeah. But
big fan, yeah.
But at the core, if you look at what he's offering re-enchantment of the world. He's offering inspiration to take responsibility and to train oneself, practice oneself, like have a bit of discipline. And I think this is the kind of missing piece that mindfulness was for some people addressing as well without really knowing it. For some people, the mindfulness is a way of being, falling in love with the life again, like, with mindful awareness and, the kind of this kind of evangelistic bent that sometimes happens when people practice for the first time and feel like they're kind of like aware of things for the first time, like, wowzers, moss, or
Right.
Whatever it is they start staring at as if they're stoned or something. I mean, that's not everybody, of course, but like I've certainly heard those anecdotes. There's that kind of sort of re-enchantment element, which I think is particularly true when practicing not necessarily in the kind of strictly scientific materialist contexts. And you have this, like I can have some sovereignty, some agency over my inner landscape. It's up to me. And I suppose maybe I have responsibility for the sake of my wife, husband, colleagues or whatever, to do some inner work.
Mm-hmm.
And that, the role of inner work in our society is totally missing. So mindfulness comes along and kind of creates that. In fact, in advertising, we have a word for this. It's called doing a category job. So say that no one's ever heard of a car before, like it's the first car on the market, Model T Ford or something, The Ford have got to sell the idea of a car, not just the Model T Ford. Do you know what I mean? They're introducing an entirely new thing and convince people that you should probably like sell your horse and cart and consider the combustion engine, And then over time, of course, like there are loads of cars. Everyone knows what a car is. You haven't got to tell them. And instead, like it's like this car over that car or whatever. But mindfulness coming on the scene is a little bit like, the Model T to some extent. And my job, doing the languaging, or John's job or your job, has been, without realizing it, doing a category job, which is a huge amount of labor. As soon as you've done as soon as you have this category of like, okay, we should all be considering our capacities of heart and mind, that are transferable to everything the mind touches, mindfulness becomes a shoe-in. Like it's the most obvious thing to do because it's like one of the most evidence-based, broadly effective for a range of different sort of outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. Or at very least, your training programs should be informed by mindfulness if not like, targeted just for, to be mindfulness based or, primarily interested in mindfulness. They should definitely have, mindfulness as an important ingredient. So I would say that can be an inquiry of people. It's just like, who do you want to be? Like, what are the good things? What are your values? Do you want to be generous? Do you want to be appreciative and aware of when your friends or your family need your support or careful listening? Right? Do you want to be those things? I'll tell you what, we now know the brain is plastic.
Mm-hmm.
We now know that we can change in our adult life to radical degrees, including the personality indices that we used to think were set from the age of 7, back when I did a psychology degree.
Yeah.
So if you start from where they are and say, so what do you want more of in your heart and in your mind?
Mm.
And what do you want less of? Like, what would it give you good? Well, and then go, well, there are these evidence-based reasons why mindfulness is a good start, but like it might not be the right thing for them. I guess there's that openness as well. Yeah. And recognizing that there are now other similar evidence-based things on the market, on the horizon. But for some people, it might be reading or journaling or, that kind of thing.
This podcast is sponsored by Be Present Coaching, upskilling business professionals with mindfulness tools. Check out bepresent.uk for more information on corporate courses and guided mind exercises. So where are you based, Jamie?
Well, the Mindfulness Initiative is based in London. I've been based in Sheffield the last 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sheffield. I see. And Jonathan, where are you based?
I'm in Alton, Illinois, USA. I'm about 30 minutes from St. Louis, Missouri.
Wow, cool.
Yeah. Guy and I are always talking, and I'm always telling Guy, like, what can I do? And there's so many issues. Just, we talk about mindfulness. There's a lot of people out here where I am, that have never even heard of mindfulness, what it means, what is that? I've been a musician for many years. I had some hearing loss. I went to an ear doctor, and they said, well, we can't do a lot about the ear ringing, but you can do this thing called mindfulness-based treatment. I'm not sure what that is, but you can look it up. And I said, well, I know a little bit about it, but it's just these things benefit us so much that we want to share them. But it goes, like your work, it goes so far beyond that. I mean, the heroin epidemic that we've been dealing with here hasn't gone anywhere. 90% of the Ritalin is manufactured here and prescribed here, and it's like, how do we turn away from these things? We need to turn toward them and start questioning them and saying, okay, how can we individually wake up to some of this stuff and, again, encourage people to do the same? So thank you so much for answering that.
Yeah. So Jonathan, I was just saying that the second half, I'd like to get a little bit deeper into it. And so my question is around the intentionality, right? And so one of the comments you made is that attention is susceptible to hijack. And then you also went on to say that in this idea of, storytelling and being able, how do you best put the story forward? How do you, come across and resonate with people? And then I think the way that you had expressed it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jamie, this idea of this being intentional, right? So can you talk a little bit about what does it mean to be intentional, and why is that important?
Yeah, great. So over the last few years, we've been developing a narrative and evidence framework to understand why mindfulness and compassion are foundational capacities. And our first publication was Mindfulness Developing Agency in Urgent Times. So this is how we develop our power, I guess, to act in the meta crisis in a time of confusion and disruption. And then we went on to look at the climate crisis in particular. And in both those documents, action is key. Obviously, we need to act on the climate. And, the purpose of the first document was to look at how our ability to act is sort of underdeveloped and undermined by digital media and various other things that we lay out there as part of the problem statement. And a big part of what we're lacking is awareness of what our values are, like really clarity on what we really think is important.
Yeah.
Clarity in terms of what our deeper intentions are, and then an ability to act in line with those values and intentions. If you ask people, what are the values that guide your life and guide your decisions? Vast majority of people have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's a revelatory process to go through. Like, what am I really doing here? Am I really just sort of doing what I should be doing? Because, I went to university because I sort of should, and, got a job in whatever, because what I was best at. And, but I think mindfulness as a way of interrupting autopilot, of responding creatively rather than reacting blindly to impulse or habit, is a way of living life on purpose in a way that is considered and aligned.
Yeah.
And there are mindfulness training interventions that really make use of this mechanism. So most popular probably is acceptance and commitment therapy. What's called a mindfulness informed intervention. It's about helping patients, because it's initially anyway a kind of clinical application, although it is used in the workplace and more broadly, to define what a good life looks like by their own standards, to look at how maybe some of their problems are out of alignment with that, to make commitments to change it because of that lack of alignment, and then using mindfulness to act more at the time on purpose so that it's more aligned. And that's hugely important for us as individuals. But if you look at this writ large across society, if you ask people what they really value, it's often intrinsic. Most often, 75% of people will say it's largely intrinsic values. So these are things like nature, family, community, love, generosity, stuff which are kind of like good for their own sake. That's why it's intrinsic. Whereas extrinsic is sort of stuff that's a means to an end. And we tend to accumulate it or value it. No, we're not quite sure why, I guess. But so, money, power, fame, status, which should theoretically get us something down, trade it off for something down the way. But 25% of us say, no, that is most important in life. I value that most. And we should, I want to. The problem is that although 75% of us say that, intrinsic values are most important to us, we think most other people are extrinsically motivated. They're just really out for money, fame, power, status, wealth, And so it's a sort of prisoner's dilemma. We kind of think everyone else is sort of out for all that stuff. So why should, I act with a sort of generous open heart or something? I know it's possible. So as a society, we have driven off the cliff. Like climate chaos is here. We're already locked into hugely risky level of warming that could lead, and probably is already leading, to feedback loops, which will be unstoppable. So if you speak to climate scientists, they say, like 95% of them say, I don't believe it's any more possible to get the 1.5 target, which is what the international community is geared towards. That is our only hope, really, of avoiding catastrophic knock-on effects. This is a survey, by the way, in Nature of the top climate scientists, 95% saying, publicly, I'm saying, yeah, UN goals, 1.5 degrees, let's try and keep it there. Privately, 95% say, like, no way. I'm just saying that to reinforce the fact that we've driven off the cliff already. And it's just the case now of making sure that the landing, that we have a landing that is not going to completely explode us, our civilization. And every shade of a degree matters. That's why it's so urgent. But it's so out of alignment with what we say is important. Yeah. It's going to destroy communities. It's going to make, it is already devastating nature. It's going to make us, much less able to be generous. The kind of open societies that we have are going to sort of be increasingly more kind of reactionary and closed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As we make the case in the Reconnection report, it's that lack of clear values, intentionality, acting in line with that. That's anyway one part of what we call the inner dimension of the climate crisis, which has until quite recently been largely ignored by mainstream policy and research in the climate world.
When you use the word intentional, right, you say it's been more intentional. Where I come from as a mindfulness teacher, and it's, we keen to get your feedback. And is that It's because most of the time we are not intentional.
No.
Exactly. So that's why when you say intentional, in my mind, is like your audience think, okay, well, I'm already very intentional and this helps me be a little bit more intentional. Or it's like, we're not intentional at all.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So so when you can say, intentional. Do they understand the severity that it's like, wow.
That's a really good point.
It's not just like, oh, I'm this much intentional. And I want to be a little bit more intentional, right? I'm wealthy. I want to be a little bit more wealthy. Or I'm not. It's like, because again, when I'm working with my students, one of the exercises that I do in the first 5 minutes is I'll just ask them to close their eyes, take a few breaths, but then I say, what is it that you're thinking? I won't give any rules other than just, like the old catchphrase host, just say what you see. And then as people say it out, and I've done this with like over 100 people in my research, and it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm a bit bored or I'm this, but there's like thought, and then a thought, then a thought, then a thought. And then I ask the question, well, don't think of anything. Now what do you see? And it's like, it's the same pattern. And it's like, when you mention the term autopilot, it's like there's this series of thinking that happens inevitably from the moment you wake up to the moment that you go to sleep. And thinking is amazing, right? That's where creativity and all that comes from. But it's that intentionality, when you're at the dinner table with your kids, do you want to be thinking about the meeting tomorrow morning? Yes or no? Did you know that you had choice that moment? Or when you're watching Netflix, and then all of a sudden you think of that argument that you had earlier on, and it's like the hijacking expression that you use. It's like that skill of saying, okay, I see you, Mr. Thought, but right now I'm watching a movie. I'll address you later. Or, I won't address you at all. But that from the moment to moment experience, this hijacking is constantly going on. And that in every moment to moment, there is also choice. Mm-hmm. And it's through the awareness and through the practice of like, oh yeah, now I sit down and I close my eyes to do the meditation, and a thought arises, and another thought arises, another thought arises. But the more you do it, it's like, oh, well, that's just the way it is. Thoughts are going to constantly arise. And so this idea that I am not my thoughts, and in the William Kuchen kind of like, I'm not my first thought, the first arrow. But this idea of choice at every moment, and that's what I'm getting to, is like with a lot of the students that I work with, after having experienced just sitting quietly and noticing thoughts arise, and that this bombardment of this series of thoughts and thinking, whether you like it or not, thoughts are going to arise. But the more that you notice that, it's that you're not necessarily your first thought. The first thought can come on, but it's that space in which there's choice to say, do I want that fork in the road? Do I want to act on it or not? And it's not, and it's not in these big ideas. It's literally in these micro moment to moment experiences that this choice and this fork in the road takes place. So much so that it's like a superpower. And I've spoken with John Kabat-Zinn about this. He goes, it's a superpower. Mm-hmm. Because it's like Plato's allegory of the cave, and the idea that you're living in with everybody in society. This is society. This is the norm. This is what is the expected. And then, you have this character that leaves the cave and then goes and sees that the reality is that this is just shadows being, silhouetted onto the cave. But the reality that the chicken that you see is not a chicken. It's actually a reflection of the chicken on that. Mm-hmm. And what is your understanding or interpretation when you hear that, and this idea that, when we talk about the advantages of mindfulness, less stress, more community and more productivity, more creativity. But on one extreme, it's also, how do you escape from this autopilot, escape from this zombie mode? And when you say autopilot, it's like the real warning sign is that, it is. What's the alternative? The fact that we are constantly thinking, and in this thinking, we're not realizing that there's this choice in each moment. So like, someone says something, I react versus then respond, but it's constantly all throughout the day. So it may be a bit, worded in my description there, but, I just wanted to get your take on that moment to moment experience and the idea of choice. And if I would say, what's the real, of the most top couple of benefits, profound benefits of what mindfulness brings versus the stress reduction and the maybe less physical pain and stuff, what are more the philosophical kind of deeper aspects of being aware that you don't have to be this zombie, and that in each moment to moment, and the thinking whether you like it or not is never going to end. But it's how you then, as the observer, or what John calls the awareness to it, how does that change your experience? How you play this avatar when you wake up every day, Jamie, how that plays.
So it's really difficult to tell people without showing them quite how unaware, unintentional, on zombie mode.
But isn't that scary though? Because once you realize that is scary, because you say, that's why and the reason why I brought up is you say intentionality. And my point is like, yeah, because you're living your life unintentionally.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what I mean? And I think that's one of extremely profound, right?
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the big learning points, of course, the first day or two of the course.
But does it even get I mean, because that is a hard message, because if you can translate that in 1 or 2 days, then credit to you. But that's,
well, I mean, like you say about your thoughts, people start to get a sense like, wow, I am not in control of my own mind.
Yeah, and how crazy, how repetitive, how random, and how incessant those thoughts are, right?
And when it comes to like practicing it during the day, you realize like, I really wanted to be mindful today, but I really wasn't. Like, I tried for a little bit, then I forgot for about 3 hours, and I drove home and I wasn't even aware of it, etc. So yeah, in the first couple of weeks of inquiry, often that stuff does come up, but it's starting from where people are, and where people are is having a very little understanding of what the problem is, that they're addressing on a mindfulness course, and it sort of goes back to asking people, like, what are you practicing? Mm-hmm. Could also be, are you aware of ways in which your mind will be not serving you and people around you? So that can be talking about autopilot and lack of awareness, or it could be talking about like biases and ways in which we predictably get caught up and come unstuck. Yeah. But to answer your question about the profound benefit,
and even what is the main benefit of mindfulness for you? Because some people say, oh yeah, it made me, every time I have a meeting now, I'm not so stressed about it. It's okay, great. And in the conversation, a great byproduct almost of.
Well, I'm gonna sidestep your question.
Go for it.
Because I'm not a main benefit kind of salesman. I'm a
storyteller. So tell me this,
synthesizer exactly. I'm a synthesizer of a large amount of information into a form. I think it can be understood and digested in a way that it has not been understood and digested before. And so if we start off, looking at the Mindfulness Developing Agency in Urgent Times document, I recommend, all of our documents are free as PDFs, and you can also buy them at cost online in print versions. But in that Mindfulness Developing Agency in Urgent Times document, we have a framework there at the beginning. And that breaks down the faculties of agency, this like power to act in the world, into 3 domains. And the first one is the domain of perception, seeing and processing information in the world. And in there we have how mindfulness is obviously more than just attention training, but attention is so important. And if you had to say anything, I mean, it's the thing that's most commonly understood, I guess. I'm keen to say something more interesting, but like the faculty of attention renders our world for us. It binds together all these other kind of cognitive and emotional functions, and it creates the world that you see. And so people who are in control of your attention are in control of your world.
But that's when you speak about the idea of hijacking, right?
Exactly. Attentional hijacked from digital.
But if that's that's the dilemma, right? So yes, the attention is and how you perceive the world, but if you have this thing that's constantly hijacking you at every step and meeting you every step of the way in this hijack, and you might have this wonderful thought.
And in that document, we say mindfulness isn't enough on its own to be equal to the algorithms powered by AI that know you better than know yourselves. But it might give you a little bit of space and awareness to be able to get in protocols and protection mechanisms that make you, more able to do it. So, but also in that perception section domain, we have, for instance, receptivity, which is I mentioned our definition of mindfulness being, awareness that is open, allowing, curious, and kind. And these qualities sort of work together to broaden the bandwidth of perception, to help us to be open to novel information, and particularly challenging or difficult information, and can radically make more of it information available to us. Not only that, it also opens up new sort of channels of knowing, particularly through the body.
Yeah.
So it's our bodies that help us with empathy. It's our bodies that help us with tuning into our values and working out whether we're acting in line with them, etc. So that is a really important component. So yes, it helps us to perceive the world more accurately, to see, to be receptive to more types and depth of information. Moving on to the second domain, this is what we call understanding, or making sense of the world, making sense and making decisions. And this includes the commonly documented outcome of mindfulness training, which is it improves our perspective. And politicians say this all the time. It's one of the main things that they talk about. It really helps me with my perspective. I don't get so caught up and lost in the hurly-burly of politics. Helps me see
holistic,
the trees.
yeah.
Helps me see other people's perspectives. So it helps with cognitive flexibility and perspective taking, and of course helps us to get a new perspective on our thoughts, which really supports this sense making. So you have a bit of separation between you and your thoughts, and particularly in politics, where like if you disagree with my thoughts and I'm totally identified with that thought, you're attacking me.
Yes, yeah. Us versus them.
We have a little bit of space. I can go. I can see that you're not attacking me. You're attacking my proposal.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's a different thing.
Yeah.
So this is fundamental for the way we can keep things on the workbench of the mind. It helps working memory, helps perspective taking, and helps with sort of collective intelligence as well, ways in which we make sense together. And then moving on to the kind of third domain we have,
the action.
After we've seen the world, understood the world, then it's like, what do we do about it? How do we? And then this is back into the territory of like intentionality, living on purpose, responding, not reacting, and also regulating difficult emotions, anger, etc., and boosting pro-social emotions, pro-social affects and intentions, compassion, kindness, etc., to help us actually work collectively in the face of our shared challenges. So yeah, I can't offer you one, but I can offer you a framework to think about all of them at the same time, which is perceiving, understanding, and acting. And yeah, basically our document is working through that framework to get all these data points from this vast evidence base into a constellation that makes sense.
So where can our listeners and our audience go to get this information? And also, you can share the website, but also if they were going to start, what are a couple of top couple of articles or videos or something that you would recommend? Hey, if you want to find out a bit more about us, here's some of the cool things we've done recently. Check out these couple of things first, and then I'll put them down in the bio that they can just, if they want to go check it out, check out this first.
So there's a couple of videos. There's an interesting video of mindfulness being mentioned by the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. So if you go to our website and find the page that talks about the all-party parliamentary group on mindfulness, you can see Chris Rowan, who I mentioned earlier, is founding this program in Parliament, asking a question of the then Prime Minister, and her response on that, and the response of the House Speaker of the House of Commons is really interesting. Then there's a video of the day that we brought together 40 politicians from 14 different countries for a day of practice and inquiry with John Kabat-Zinn. So that's really interesting, hearing the politicians themselves talk about the impact of these practices on their lives. And then we have our newest document is probably, it's maybe a bit more accessible than the agency document. So this is called Reconnection, Meeting the Climate Crisis Inside Out. So it's kind of more for a generalist policymaker audience, whereas the agency document somewhat more detailed for mindfulness geeks. And on that webpage, if you go to our website and then work and publications, you'll find this page, and it's got our launch webinars, and like I say, all of our documents downloaded for free, and we've got scores on there. So all the way back to the Mindful Nation UK report back in 2015 that is still referenced even today, because there hasn't really been anything like it since.
Awesome.
It is truly fascinating. And again, such, just given that Jonathan and I, the conversation that we had with these mindfulness luminaries, and to have someone like you that's so proactive in being at the forefront of how do we make this part of, policy? How do we educate those that make the decisions to kind of, help educate them and understand? So for you, in the Action for Happiness style, what matters most to you?
I'm afraid survival at this point, because it is seriously in doubt. depending on how old you are, it'll be in your lifetime. But we're confronted by biosphere, ecosystem collapse, transgression of planetary boundaries, erosion of soils, collapse of, all kinds of things that support our life on our only home. And we don't realize, I don't think, quite how fragile our interconnected, just-in-time, globalized societies are, and our sort of political systems are. And we take a lot of it for granted. And when stuff gets real, when it hits the fan, as it were, it's going to be rough, and it's soon. So yeah.
So what are you? Yeah. And what are you hopeful about?
I'm hopeful that human beings are, like, deep down underneath it all, intrinsically good, and that we're starting to get a rebalancing of the stories we tell about ourselves. In the 20th century, we had this sort of selfish gene thing, and competition is good, and individualizing narratives, and we're starting to see through science and observation, other types of observation, that actually we have hugely pro-social tendencies, collaborative tendencies, that we have these intrinsic values to heart, that we have a tremendous potential if we only feed those sides of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what these practices can help us do.
And again, that's why people like you keep people like Jonathan and I hopeful that, that the future is bright, and that, that there is a path.
On the other side of the age of consequences, but we're going to have to go through that together.
Well, like you said, like there's so many animals and species that have become extinct in the past 50 years, and there's going to have to be some casualties in this neglect. But at the same time, there is a new era of education, especially around mindfulness, like you said, was maybe very esoteric or unheard of, maybe like a handful of years ago, but now is at the forefront. And it's, it's an education of the general population that it's starting to become more and more prevalent.
Yeah. And like you said, stories, I mean, the deep realization that, like you said, we all are thinking most of the time and don't even realize it. And how, the worst example of being driven by our own stories can lead to so much othering all the way to war, so let's pay it forward.
Yeah. Amen.
So my last question to you before I go is, like, for the next guest who you don't know who it's going to be, what question would you like to ask to them?
So this is someone who maybe like works or in the area of mindfulness or
potentially, yeah.
Potentially, but maybe not. Okay. What has been your most valuable practice?
Okay.
We get some surprising answers to that sometimes.
We will do.
And like, so some people who are, really into mindfulness or whatever might not say that. And I asked that to someone recently, and they were like, gratitude journaling. Oh no, gratitude journaling and morning pages, which is where you get up and just write whatever comes into your head.
Yeah. Well, Jamie, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I love the way you talk.
Indeed.
I love the way you present.
Thank you.
I don't know, you have a very posh accent, up in Sheffield. I don't know if that's what I'm saying. But you sound very, articulate when you speak.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's wonderful. So thank you so much for doing this. And it's just so thrilled to, as I'm trying to understand my direction in life. Now, I've been 16 years in the corporate world at a software company, which I left in July. Now teaching mindfulness full time. I'm really trying to understand, how do I make a bigger impact? How do I help? And understanding, what's important to me, and then trying to, with people like you and John and Mathieu, and just really understand how do we help contribute and give ourselves a chance of being successful in the future, with climate, with life, and with happiness. And so it was just an honor to speak with you today.
Likewise. Yeah.
Thanks for coming. Thank you, Jamie.
Love to meet you both.
If we could do this again, perhaps in 2023 at some point,
Sure.
I would love to just get a catch up. And
if there's something you particularly like to talk about, absolutely, I'd be happy.
Yeah.
We didn't cover the detail of the reconnection report or narrative, so maybe we catch up when that's
yes,
an impact or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Absolutely.
Cool.
and I'd be happy even to drive to Sheffield or something, and bring the equipment.
Where are you based again?
I'm London. I'm near Wembley.
London. Yeah, well, I'm in London quite a bit as well. So
Yeah,
I'm sure
yeah.
we could-
So I would love to in the studio maybe have one at some point. But thank you so much for all the work that you do, for taking the time. And when people say I've got to stop on the hour, hard stop, but you were like, I'm cool. If you want to go beyond the hour, I've got time set aside, and
It's
been great.
I really appreciate that, and thank you so much. Thanks for making it this far and showing your support and love to the podcast. A big thanks again to Be Present Coaching for their support. Find out more about their masterclass mindfulness courses and free guided meditations at bepresent.uk. bepresent.uk. I'm your host, Guy, and this is the Mindful News Podcast. If you've taken away something from today's episode, please go ahead and share the link with a friend. Until next week.